Paul Krugman è un grande economista.
So Paul Krugman is a great economist. He has offered a fundamental contribution to economic research. He has opened new disciplines in economic theory. But Paul, in addition to all this, is also one of the most influential people in the world. Well, why? Because with his columns, published twice a week in the New York Times, he can actually reach out to a very influential and important audience of readers. And so he's, in a certain way, able to condition the debate or to raise issues which are going to be discussed on economic policies, not just for the United States economic policies, but also for the whole world. And Paul is influential because he is very good at communicating on very complex issues. In particular, in one of his books, he had classified the various typologies of economy textbooks you can find in a bookshop. That is to say, normally you find the Greek letter economics. These are normally scientific treatises containing various formulas, and so they use Greek alphabet, and they are inaccessible to the broader audience. Then there are the so-called up and down books, that is to say, texts which simply comment on data with graphs, charts, some indicators going up, others going down, and they tend to be extremely boring. Well, they might give us some information for some time, but then they become entirely useless, because when we are no longer up and we are down, that story is no longer interesting for us. And then there are the airport economics textbooks, which are normally bought at airport bookshops or newsstands just before boarding a plane, and normally they contain very strong theses in economics. Either they're extremely optimistic or they're extremely pessimistic. There's no middle-of-the-road solution, and they try to attract the attention of the public in general, but they're not really interesting. Their predictions tend to prove wrong very soon, and so they don't really enrich us from a cultural viewpoint. So this analysis of the categories of economic books has led Paul Krugman to develop a new type of economic books, that is to say, books which discuss the pros and cons of different economic theories, books which illustrate the trade-offs related to various approaches, and he does it in a form which is extremely readable and enjoyable for the broad audience. So I don't think that we could have chosen a better economist to inaugurate this festival, because you know that the issue this year, the theme this year, market and democracy, and indeed Paul has been working on these issues for years. On the market, because his contribution to economic theory is related to the development of the market and of the markets. Paul has been working on the theory of exchange in international trade, and Paul has shown the major role played in this respect by economies of scale, as well as by product differentiation. So he has been able to explain aspects which other economists who had not taken into account economies of scale were unable to explain. For instance, exchange or trade between developed countries who had the same level of development of productive factors. And these can be explained by economies of scale. In addition to this, he has further expanded the paradigm of economists who had been traditionally studying international economics by adding an important issue which had not been researched so far, that is to say, the aggregation in space of economic activity. Why is there concentration in specific spaces of productive activities? And this has brought about the development of a new discipline, that is to say, the new economic geography based on Paul's original contribution. But Paul is also extremely relevant for the debate on democracy, because Paul is a Democrat, he is a convinced Democrat, and indeed in all his books we find reference to democratic participation as a value per se. For instance, we often find reference to the importance of allowing immigrants to vote, as is the case in the United States. The trade unions, which are defined as agents which are useful to the extent to which they promote participation in the democratic voting process. And then Paul is also a Democrat when he deals with practical issues, because he stresses the need to develop policies to support competition, to prevent an excess of concentration of economic power in the markets. And this allows the markets, therefore, to work as a true form of bottom-up democracy, where consumers are kings. And Paul, therefore, loves democracy, but he's also intellectually very honest. And his latest book, The Conscience of a Liberal, which has just been translated into Italian, is based on the acknowledgement of a fact which is very hard to acknowledge for an economist. Paul actually avows, well, you know, I had always thought that the economy conditioned politics. So I believe that a number of factors which have characterized the global scene, for instance, an increase in inequality, have conditioned politics, have brought about the emergence of certain parties which supported certain social groups, have brought about a polarization also in the United States. And yet, Paul writes very bravely for an economist. Eventually, I convinced myself that it was quite the opposite. It was politics which conditioned the redistribution of income in the United States, with tax policies which eliminated the goal of redistribution of wealth, which is typical of the welfare state, from the tax system in the United States. And indeed, the political coalition which had governed the United States during the political experience of the New Deal broke up. And this brought about this explosion of inequality, of inequalities in the United States, which is also today accompanied by political polarization. So we see that there are even more extreme positions today in the political world in the United States than in the past. So this is an analysis carried out by an economist who is also critical of his own paradigms and his own analytical approach. And so it's all the more convincing. And indeed, this analysis contains interesting lessons also for our country. We have not so far experienced the social polarization, the explosion of inequalities which characterize the United States today. And yet, today, we have a situation in which we experience a loss of social cohesion, centrifugal movements. We see many calls for redistribution of income or wealth, which are actually based on single specific vested interests rather than general interests. So there is a loss of a common shared reference. There is an increase in social tension. There is widespread fear. So the experience of the United States, as described by Paul Krugman, does tell us, or could tell us, that if we let our social fabric decompose, if we allow it to decompose and to be torn apart, then we are paving the way for policies which will increase inequalities in a country and which will therefore reduce the middle class also in Italy. This has not happened yet in Italy, but it could happen. But before we get to this, and Paul has also promised that he will deal with this at the end of his lecture today, but before dealing with this, we should deal with the middle classes of the world, that is, the qualified workers in Western countries. And so Paul is going to discuss the new protagonists, the new players in the world scenario, emerging countries, China in particular. And this is very important for this festival, because it is by analyzing and studying China that we have had to, to recant our traditional theories. You know, we had always thought that there could never be a market without democracy, while the Chinese market allows us to admit that we were wrong. In China, there are markets which have allowed China to grow exponentially over the past few years, and yet in a context in which there was no democracy. But how solid is the growth of Chinese economy is the coexistence of the market with non-democratic conditions sustainable in the long run. What we had always believed, that is to say, there can be no market without democracy, will we have to reconsider this ultimately in the light of the Chinese experience? How long can China go on growing? And I now give the floor to Paul Krugman for an answer to these questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Boeri. I think I will begin by striking a blow for freedom by taking off my jacket in this very hot room.
And I do the same.
All right. So, when I was approached to speak on the subject of markets and democracy, I thought to myself that I would like to speak a little more broadly than the things I've been writing about. Clearly, I have a new book, which is certainly about markets and about democracy in the United States, and I'll come back to that towards the end of this talk. But there is a wider world, and there have been some interesting, perhaps not entirely encouraging developments in that wider world. And so I want to talk about what do we know now about the prospects for democracy in a world that is certainly given over to the market. Now, my starting point would be to turn back the clock. Think about where we were in the late years of the 1980s and the early years of the 1990s. So 1989 was the year of political miracles. It was the year of the abrupt collapse of communism in Eastern Europe. It was also the year of the Tiananmen uprising in China, which, even though it was crushed, seemed to be a portent of a rising movement for democracy in China, in the world's largest nation. So there seemed to be great change. And within a couple of more years, we had the fall of the Soviet Union. We had the full shift to democratic institutions in Eastern Europe. It really did seem that democracy was on the march and could not be stopped. There was a famous essay and their later book written at the time by Francis Fukuyama, who, of course, despite the name, was an American intellectual, on the end of history, by which he meant that essentially market democracy is the only thing that works, and we will all become democratic market societies, perhaps with some variant on how much the market would be allowed to flourish. There would be social democracy and perhaps less social democratic systems like that of the United States, but we would all converge upon market democracy. That doesn't look as certain now as it did in 1992 when Fukuyama published his book. In 1992, you could look at what was left of the world of the communist world, of the non-market, non-democratic nations, and they seem to be vestiges that would soon be gone. They're still there. It is, in fact, remarkably, Cuba, North Korea are still as they were. Now, that's arguably the least important part of the story. They are very small and of no economic importance in the world. But we have, at the same time, the continuing rise of economies that are certainly market economies, but not democratic. We have the, as some people say, the authoritarian capitalism. And this comes in many different brands, but the two countries everyone speaks of are, of course, China and Russia. Russia having seemed to be on the road to democracy for a little while, but then having turned away from it, not of course, on paper. I am rereading Edward Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, and there's a marvelous passage about Augustus that fits Putin very well, about how the world, that he understood that people are ruled by names, and as long as you are assured that you are free and the dignity of the Senate was respected, you could do whatever you liked. And so that is what has happened there. China, which remains authoritarian as ever, and there are smaller nations. Vietnam would be a smaller version of China. Authoritarian market economy now, communist in name, capitalist in practice, but extremely non-democratic. There has been some continuing progress towards democracy. Parts of the world have become more democratic. Being an American, I think first of Latin America, which has been encouraging. More democracy appears more solid than in that region of the world than it has for a long time. But still, our certainty that the world was in a permanent shift to democracy seems much reduced. So why should we still believe that democracy is the future of the world? There is one commonly cited piece of evidence, and it looks like this. If, well, I would hope that that would appear eventually. Yes, thank you. So this is showing the world as classified by Freedom House, which is an independent organization. You can quarrel a little bit with their numbers, but in the broad sense, there's no question. So green here is free. Yellow is somewhere in between, partially free, and the purple is not free. And what you see, of course, and this is a familiar common observation, is that all rich countries are democracies. Some poor countries are democracies, but many are not. So we can certainly, if we look at the low-income countries, we can say that, well, we have a free country in India, but not in China. But there is, at this point, no wealthy country, no OECD country that is not a full functioning democracy. That's encouraging. That leads us to believe that it will be a world, as we all get richer, that it will be a world of increased democracy. Just to reinforce that point slightly, this is the world as classified by income levels. And you can see the black here are the very rich countries: Western Europe, Scandinavia, North America, Australia, New Zealand. All of them now, Japan, all of them now full, free democracies. Wealth seems to bring democracy. So no problem, right? The world will become richer as technology progresses. It will become a democratic world. Well, I will raise 5 doubts about this happy story. And so I will go through. Many of them are doubts that have been raised more formally by both economists and political scientists. Some, I think, not. So let me start with something I have not seen pointed out, which I think is arguably quite important, and as a mechanical reason not to necessarily believe in the progress of democracy in the world. It relates to what Tito Boeri was just saying, which is that We are now in a world in which some previously poor countries are developing very rapidly. This is, above all, China, but it's a more widespread phenomenon, which is, by the way, a very good thing. On the whole, we very much want a world in which prosperity becomes more broadly based. But the thing about this, for the topic of today's talk, is that some of these rapidly growing countries, and above all China, are not democratic and are very poor still. And even if they grow a great deal, will become powerful economies. In the case of China, it has already become a powerful economy, but it will be even more so, but will do so at levels of income that will still leave them far below the levels of today's wealthy democratic countries. So this is not to be taken too seriously, but simply taking the actual growth of China and the United States over the past 10 years. These are, for the economist types in the room, this is GDP at purchasing power parity. So these are designed to be equivalent. And if we simply project straight trends, then somewhere in the 2020, 2021, 2022, China will become the world's largest economy. Now, this is not to be taken too seriously. We can think of all kinds of reasons why China might slow. The United States, hard to think of reasons why the United States might accelerate, but we don't know that this is what happened. But it seems very likely that sometime, hopefully in my lifetime, depending upon how well I take care of myself, I guess, China will overtake the United States as the world's largest economy. Now, it doesn't really matter. Already, China is a very powerful economy and will become much more so. China is, this is a country that doesn't have to be as productive as the United States to become a dominant world power, because it has 4 times America's population. And so if it becomes just 1/4 as productive, then it becomes the larger economy. But that implies that China will become a very powerful economy at levels of income which, even if you believed that previous graph, the charts, does not by any means guarantee a democratic system. So this is, again, now this is per capita GDP. As we said, China will become the world's largest economy on this projection 2020 or so. At that point, if we believe the straight line, China will be essentially the same level of income that Russia has today. And Russia, as we all know, although it seemed to be on a democratic track 15 years ago, did not follow that track and remains an authoritarian system today. What this all means is that we are headed for a world in which some of the largest powers, some of the greatest economies may well not be democratic, even on the sheer logic of, even on the sheer numerical logic of this sort of comparison. Now, let me, without charts, just leaving this one here, raise some further doubts. One important question is, to what extent does this picture, the rich countries are free, represent, in effect, a coincidence rather than something that is inherent? Does becoming richer make you, in any systematic way, more democratic? Is it possible to predict from an economy's success that the political unit of which that economy consists will become more democratic? And the answer appears to be, at least on the face of it, no. that if you look at whether countries that have had rapid economic growth have tended to become democratic at a greater pace than those that have had slow growth, the answer is not so. Consider the comparison between India and China. Until very recently, India was a laggard economically, had a slow rate of growth, now much faster. That's a very gratifying thing, but for an extended period, I mean, Indian economists I know used to joke about the Hindu rate of growth, which was 1% a year, now much faster. But India was a slow progress economically, and yet it remained democratic. It showed no trend towards becoming less democratic, certainly. China, on the other hand, extremely rapid economic growth, which, you know, much of the economic growth that made China what it is today has occurred since Tiananmen. So these past 20 years, spectacular success, and yet no democratization. And you can look at this much more broadly. If there have been statistical efforts, I guess I would cite Professor Acemoglu at MIT, to sort out to what extent are countries democratic through extended periods of history, to what extent do they become more democratic as they become richer. And the answer is, it seems to be all history. It seems to be that countries that are democratic have tended to stay democratic. Growth doesn't seem to contribute anything. And you might ask, how did we end up with this map? How did we end up with all of the rich countries being democratic? That raises me to my doubt number 3, which is, well, historically, it's very much a matter of contingency. If I had showed you this same map in 1943, it wouldn't exactly have told the same story. This map is the way it is because we had a great war. In that great war, the democratic powers won, and it was, of necessity, a war among the wealthy countries, because only the wealthy countries had the resources to be participants that mattered. The fact that the democratic powers won meant that they brought democracy to the rest of the advanced countries. It's not a story of something that had to happen. Bismarck is supposed to have said, when asked what he thought was the most important factor for the world's future, he said, it is the fact that North America speaks English. That was certainly the most important factor for the military history of the 20th century. And that led us to a situation in which all advanced countries are, in fact, democratic. But first of all, that was not deep logic. That was more or less just the accidents of history. And it was very, very far from being a foregone conclusion. So we are a world in which rich countries are democratic, but had a few battles gone the other way in 1942. This could be a very different story. A fourth doubt, and this is now I'll raise you a different argument. It has been argued that it's not that wealth breeds democracy, but rather the other way around. That democratic regimes are more successful economically. And while this doesn't give you the kind of automatic progress towards democracy, it does suggest that the example of successful democratic regimes would tend to, by force of example, lead to a growth of democracy in the world. Is this true? Is it true that democracies are more successful at economic growth? Well, we can't tell by looking at the advanced countries. We can't tell by looking at the wealthy countries because they're all democratic, so we have no basis for comparison. We can, however, look at less developed countries. We can look at whether those that were more democratic have been more successful economically, or whether those that have gone from democracy to authoritarian regimes or vice versa have seen a change in their economic performance. Sadly, for those of us who believe very much in democracy, the evidence really is not there. Again, India versus China, but perhaps even more so, if we were to look at some other developing countries, Brazil's best periods of economic performance came when it was under a military dictatorship. Latin America as a whole has become much more democratic since the 1980s. It has not seen the kind of acceleration in economic growth one might have hoped for. Now, the evidence does not point clearly the other way either. Dictatorships, military regimes have a very mixed track record. It's by no means clear that dictators are good for economic growth, and arguably the worst, the most extreme economic disasters tend to come from non-democratic regimes. Because there's no restraint. There's no one who can say, hey, wait, this is a really bad idea. But it's certainly not the kind of thing that would lead you to believe that democracy is a necessary condition for economic success. So they're, again, not so helpful for democracy. An interlude then. Question. How is it that we've seen as much democratization as we have? Why have the former satellite countries of the Soviet Union become democratic? Why did Southern Europe become democratic? Why in Latin America have we had significant progress towards democracy? I think the answer there, fairly clearly, is that this represents the benign influence of the established wealthy democratic countries. It's not the only source, of course, but very important. So, two European examples. If we think about the changes that took place during the two enlargements of the European community in the 1970s and more recently, it was very clear that the association between being a democratic nation, having freedom, being a respectable country in the eyes of the core of the European Union was very important for being considered eligible. I don't think, for example, now, there are multiple reasons why Russia, in its current state, could not become a member of the EU. But certainly, the authoritarian regime is an insuperable barrier. I think we can say the concrete benefits of EU membership, and perhaps more broadly, the general aura that you want to be part of Europe, meant that to be part of Europe, you had to be democratic. It was clear that for Spain, Portugal, Greece, in the aftermath of their regimes, that the attraction of the countries to their north was a very important factor. In the United States, it is, and Latin America, there is something of the same force operating. Not perhaps as clear-cut, but if we look, so now I can be something I'm a little more comfortable with talking to Europeans, because I think I know it better than you do. The case of Mexico. Now, Mexico has had, on paper, a full democracy for generations. In practice, in practice, only since 2000. Now, what caused that change? In part, a very good man became president. So Ernesto Zedillo was the first Mexican president to be serious about wanting to give the opposition a chance to win the election. But underlying all of that was the magnetism of the United States, both in crude commercial terms and in psychological terms. NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, would not have been possible had Mexico not given clear signs that it was on a path to democratization. It was quite explicit in the US discussions that the reason why NAFTA had to be approved was as a way of encouraging reformers in Mexico, and not just economic reformers, but political reformers. And the objections now, the reason why, despite what candidates may say on the campaign trail, there is no chance that the United States will significantly abridge the agreement with Mexico, is that everyone understands what a blow that would be to democracy in our southern neighbor. And perhaps, and then there's the broader diffuse, the effect of education. The reformers in Mexico very much tend to be men and women who were educated in the United States and picked up those democratic ideals. So I think that this is contingency again. The fact that we, by luck, ended up with a highly democratic, advanced world also meant that there was substantial export of the democratic idea to the developing world. Which brings me to my fifth doubt and the final stage. As long as the world's wealthiest countries remain firmly democratic, the prospects for democracy remain pretty good. Even China, although as we see, there's no strong, there's no sign so far that economic growth is making it more democratic. Nonetheless, the example of the United States, the example of the EU, will probably be positive for its future political prospects. The question we have to ask, and it's the question we never want to think about too hard, is how secure is the democratic nature of the advanced countries? This brings me a little bit to the subject of the book I've written, which was written obviously in response to the Bush years, written in the hope of something better, and I can make some arguments about why the United States, I'm sorry, I'm going to continue this process of disrobing. If this goes on much longer, I may be down to only my socks. Clearly it's been a very disturbing period in the United States. My view on how it relates to the topic of this conference, this festival, is a remark that a prominent lawyer once made to me. I think he would prefer not to be identified. But he said, if Bush hadn't turned out to be such a screw-up, the Republic would be over. There were, at this point, certainly Bush will be gone in January, and the political tides are running against the current government. But it was really striking, at the worst, in 2002 and 2003, how quickly democratic norms were abandoned. There was a broad sense of intimidation, particularly in the news media, that you dare not be critical. There was, we now know, extensive politicization of the justice system. Many U.S. attorneys, this is a special category, but very important, were replaced with essentially apparatchiks, I think would be the correct description. There were a few prominent instances of what certainly looked like judicial harassment of opposition politicians. In one case, the Democratic governor of a state ended up in prison on extremely questionable charges. So there was a wholesale politicization, and there are other things. Something you probably have not heard about here, but it's a very striking thing. There's intense lobbying by the telecommunication companies in the United States to receive from Congress legal amnesty for any things they may have done at the request of the White House. Now, they don't actually admit having done anything, but the ferocity with which this legal, this lobbying is being pursued suggests very strongly that there was extensive abuse, that there was extensive illegal monitoring of U.S. citizens, perhaps of political opponents. I'll be disappointed if I don't find that I was being bugged, but it will. How did that happen? Well, that's a long story. But what we see in the United States was that it wasn't just a couple of men. It wasn't just Bush and Cheney. What we see in the United States clearly was that a political movement, very organized political movement, again, I don't mean to be constantly talking about my book, but it's described there at some length, a consciously organized political movement with a great deal of certainty in its goals and very little commitment to the broader issues of democracy, fair play, was in power. And it was in a position to move in ways that were a serious compromising of the democratic ideal. Now, it failed. This is the good news. We have, in fact, seen a visible loss of power even before the change in the White House next year. But it was a serious reminder that democracy is not so secure as we like to think. I would go a little bit further and suggest that economics may have played an important role in this crisis of democracy in the United States. If we ask what the political movement was about in the United States, it was about ultimately about lower taxes for the wealthy and lower benefits for the poor and the middle class. It was, if you like, it was about increasing inequality, and the determination to do that was even though that sounds like a fairly prosaic goal, apparently gave license to all kinds of violation of democratic procedure. So the United States has, I think, has experienced a near miss at a crisis of democracy, and it's not so hard to see how that could happen in other countries. Bottom line, fundamental conclusion. We have seen an advance of democracy in the world. The events of 1989 through 1991 did make the world a much more democratic place and a safer place for democracy. This is not to deny that. There has been significant democratic progress in some other places. Again, I would cite Brazil as a striking example of a country with a very poor political history that now appears to have a quite solidly democratic government. But it's not guaranteed. It's not something that is given to us by the working of some immutable historical law. There's nothing that says that market economies are necessarily democratic. There's nothing that says that the progress of market economies necessarily makes them more democratic. The progress we've made in democracy is the result of men and women who were really committed to achieving it. And the future of democracy rests not in what will happen to world GDP per capita, but in the kinds of leaders that we have. Thank you.
Quindi non c'è nulla di inevitabile dietro al progresso.
So there's nothing unavoidable behind the progress and democratization. Democracy does not simply come from economic growth. We touched upon a number of topics, and this opening lecture will pave the way to a number of other sessions where we're going to discuss these issues. I would ask you now to ask a few questions. Please remember to be rather brief and to speak inside the microphone. We are also connected with other two rooms, the room of the regional government and the press room next on our left. So please remember to use the microphone. We're very happy to see that there is such a large attendance to this festival. So the floor is open to questions.
My name is Francesco, and I'm a PhD candidate. I would like to thank Professor KRUGMAN for this extremely didactical inaugural discussion. And I would like to make two specific questions. The first question relates to two men, and the second question would relate to theories. I mean, the first question, the first man is Keynes, who you are picking up several points on Keynes' intellectual legacy. And I wonder if Keynes could say something about democracy and markets. One can argue, if I'm not wrong, you wrote an introduction to the general theory of Keynes, but one can think of the consequences of peace as the intellectual manifesto of Keynes on the theme of democracy and market. And the second man will be Riccardo Faini, who will be remembered during the festival. If I'm not wrong, you had been one of the, you have been studying together with Riccardo Faini, and if you could say something on him. The very last question would be on well, still markets and democracy. I mean, in the opening discussion, the theme of fears against globalization clearly came out. Interestingly, one of the speakers of the second edition was Tremonti, who wrote a book on explicitly on globalization, fears and hopes. And the specific question would be, can we take your theories of new geography as to a certain extent, a specific case for protectionism, or is Tremonti completely wrong, I mean, in his intellectual assumptions? Thanks a lot.
Why don't I answer as we go? So, okay. And just to say, an appreciation of Riccardo Faini was my classmate in graduate school. We shared some of the same deep concerns about economics, about regions. I just, you know, it was a shock and a tragedy that he died so young. And I attended, spoke at in Torino, an event to commemorate him. Not much more, you know, just this is a very sad story. On Keynes, I view Keynes as someone who, among other things, sought to save democracy. Partly what he was doing was saying, you do not have to become Stalin to solve this depression. I can offer you a technical solution. And it was clear that he viewed that as the answer. And of course, the economic consequences of the peace was very much a reaction to the folly of the policies after World War I. And you can say that in an indirect way, Keynes's writing in 1919 helped to shape the policies of the victorious Allies in 1946, 47, and 48. that the determination not to repeat the errors that Keynes laid out so much in his in the economic consequences of the piece played an important role in the success at establishing democracy throughout Western Europe and in Japan. So this is a happy story. I will say that Keynes's long-run view, he had a famous essay on economic prospects for our grandchildren, which would have been about the world as it should be around now, and he projected that we would all be sufficiently rich that essentially greed would have vanished from the world. And it turns out that doesn't matter how rich you are, greed remains. Globalization. I didn't talk about that. I think I actually believe that that we should try to reduce our fear of globalization. That there has been, I've noticed that quite a lot in Europe, that there is a belief that the concerns that some political groups are expressing about globalization portend some catastrophic change in economic policy. I don't think that's right. I think there is there are some genuine reasons for workers to be concerned about the impact of competition from abroad. Politicians are responding to some degree to that concern, but it's not, I don't see any sign that we're about to have a dramatic return to protectionism. I think that would be, among other things, the consequences for foreign relations would be so severe that the United States certainly won't do that. What we can say is that the best antidote to protectionism, to fears of globalization, does not seem to be having economists tell you what a good thing free trade is and what a bad thing protectionism is. People have heard that thousands of times. The best thing seems to be creating effective social democracies that provide a fair amount of protection against the consequences. So we find the countries that are most agreeable in dealing with globalization are Denmark, Sweden, countries with very extensive social safety nets. And that in the United States, if we have workers complaining bitterly about globalization, that's in large part because in the United States, if you lose your job, the fall is so far. I mean, the United States, uniquely among wealthy countries, is a country where losing your job when your factory closes also means losing health care. It means a level of misery that no other advanced country permits. So I think that's the answer. I think the world has had enough of economists preaching free trade. I'm prepared to make that case, but this is not the answer.
Grazie, quindi dobbiamo avere paura della paura e proteggerci dagli effetti negativi della globalizzazione, soprattutto creando...
So we must be afraid of fear, as it were. And to protect ourselves from the negative effects of globalization, we need social networks and social security networks. In Italy, actually, we do health services, even if you lose your job, but we don't really have social support networks, social security networks. Questions may also be asked in Italian, if you wish. Please. Yes, at the bottom.
Ne approfitto per ricordarvi che domani sera ricorderemo.
I'd like to remind you all that tomorrow evening we are going to commemorate Riccardo Farini here in Trent. Good evening. My name is Francesco. In your speech, you also mentioned the weakening of democracy in the United States because of the Bush administration and because of the contribution of certain economic forces inside the United States. So my question is very simple. Have you identified the causes which have induced this attempt to derail, to fail? In particular, has the Bush administration failed in its attempt to weaken democracy in the United States because the Bush administration was incompetent, simply, or perhaps because there were antibodies in the democracies, as there should be in any democracy?
Okay. Yes. There were some antibodies. There were certainly people who spoke out against the administration. The American public proved harder to bully than we had feared. One of the surprising features of recent U.S. history is that the public, in effect, turned on Bush long before major institutions did. That the public became very negative, and it was only a couple of years later that, for example, the news media began to be more critical. So it was the American population turns out to have more democratic instincts than we feared, but the American institutional structure did not do very well. And I think you can argue pretty strongly that if the Bush administration had been more competent, if they had not failed so dismally in the war, in the management of the economy, that we would have been at serious risk. That it really was, let's put it this way, before the incompetence was fully revealed, in, let us say, the summer of 2003, it was a very frightening time to be a critic. It did not feel as if the institutions were holding. It was an extraordinarily stressful time. So I think that this is not, this did not have to happen. We came out of it, I believe, all right, but it did not have to happen. It was a very, very, very frightening period.
Mi fa venire da porre una domanda anch'io, cioè se negli Stati Uniti prende così tanto.
Well, this induces me to ask you a question myself. If in the USA it takes so long before the incompetence of the leadership emerges, well, I wonder what about more imperfect democracies? How long do we need to realize how incompetent is our government? No specific reference made. Okay, any questions? Any more questions?
Roberto Tamborini, Department of Economics. I have two questions. The first concerns the relationship between democracy and economic performance, and I'd like to ask you to tell something about another indicator, which is the distribution of income. Yes. So some people think that there is a virtuous circle between democracy and better income distribution and vice versa. The second question concerns the recent experience of the US that you have reminded us, which, by the way, in some extent has been common to other Western countries after 2001, etc. And let me play as the devil's advocate, yeah, and say, we know that democracy is a weak regime and must be protected. So there is, in a sense, a legitimacy to retreat in some way to some democratic freedom to protect democracy. Especially so if this request of protection of something which is considered important comes from citizens, from the electorate. So the problem is, to what extent is it legitimate to abide from democracy to protect democracy, and where would you draw the line,
Right.
whether you say this is no longer legitimate?
Okay. Distribution of income. More broadly, social policies, social indicators. There is no clear evidence that democratic regimes are more successful at GDP growth. There is, however, substantial evidence that they do a better job of taking care of the poor, that they do a better job of assuring nutrition, that they do a better job of assuring essential health care. So in that sense, it is not that democracy brings you nothing except freedom itself. Democracy is also better for human beings. So if you were to ask, do democratic regimes achieve better GDP growth, the answer is no. Do they perform better on measures of human development? Yes, they do. So that there is that. No, this is entirely correct. In some ways, the United States may be to some extent the exception in that we have had very high inequality without much of a political backlash, but that may be changing too. But looking at the developing world, it's quite clear. It's quite clear, for example, in Latin American countries, that the democratization of the region has also been accompanied by a move to take better care of the less fortunate in society. So this is freedom is enough, but this is another good thing about democracy. Yes, democracy must be protected, certainly. And we have, in U.S. history, we have presidents, very honorable presidents. Abraham Lincoln suspended many of the rules of law for several months at the beginning of the U.S. Civil War. And he did so to preserve the Union and, in the end, to abolish slavery. So this was a case of violating democratic rules to defend democracy, and it was obviously one of history's great events. And there have been certainly, there have been episodes in which politicians who are firmly democratic in their beliefs have tampered with the rules in moments of crisis. The story of the United States, however, in recent years was one of huge overreaction. We had a situation in which, and there were certainly many books, many articles making the point that you were raising as devil's advocate. Well, don't we need to give up some of our liberties in order to defend ourselves? But the reaction was out of all proportion to the threat. In the end, 19 men armed with box cutters pulled off a terrorist attack, which was extremely damaging. But the reaction in terms of domestic politics was as if we were fighting World War II again, as opposed to a handful of lightly armed terrorists. There was clearly a determination on the part of our leadership to use the attack as an excuse to seize power. And at the same time, sorry, I'm getting into my American outrage, but I think this is very real. At the same time, the basic security measures were neglected, even as rule of law was being suspended in some important ways. The Bush administration was fighting efforts to tighten basic security at the airports. It was attempting to keep airport security in the hands of private corporations, even as it was demanding essentially unlimited ability to collect information on domestic residents. It was fighting basic measures to protect the ports against possible attack. So this was a power grab. It was not an honest response to a real threat.
C'è anche un'altra dimensione in cui la democrazia riesce a sostenere i poveri, c'è quello che c'è evidente.
There is also another dimension in which democracy shows support for the poor. That is to say, it reduces cyclic fluctuations, so there are fewer recessions and they last less. So this protects the poorest because they are those who suffer most from recessions. There's another question at the bottom and then one here in the first ranks. First at the bottom, there was someone who had asked for the floor, if I'm not mistaken. No? I was mistaken. Okay, so here in the first ranks.
And on American economic history. Am I right if I understand that American economy declined in the American decline in the last few years according to bad politics of a Republican government? For instance, there was this emigration of manufacturing industry outside, which was really negative. And also this decline, cutting of funds of state universities, which is not very good in as far as the research was concerned. And also, do you think that, just to finish, that the Roosevelt year was so much better? And what do you think about Robert Reich thinking about this?
Okay. On the last point, Robert Reich's book is sitting in a large stack, and I have not opened it yet. I actually would say that some, but not all, of America's economic woes are the result of bad policy. There are certainly, manufacturing, we could go on at some length. I think that it's not clear that too much could have been done to prevent the decline of manufacturing in the United States. Education is one of our great failings. I would say less the universities, although there has been a problem of funding for the state universities, but much more the basic education. The United States, with a large number of students not graduating high school, not getting basic education, this is a big problem. And it is ultimately political. We don't make the same efforts that other advanced countries do to achieve universal basic education. We make up for it to some extent by actually the excellence of some of the universities and by importing talent. So the United States remains a country where we have vast technological progress, even though too many of our citizens end up barely able to read and write. So I would say that there is a little bit of what one associates with Latin America in the United States. Excellent education at the top, but quite a lot of lack of basic education at the bottom. Again, that's the sort of thing that democracies are supposed to be good at at avoiding. That democracies are supposed to take care of the less fortunate, but why the United States does not is a long story. Just say that as with so many things in America, race and the history of slavery ends up playing an important role. But that takes, I think, quite far afield from this conference.
Sì, in effetti I dati PISA sugli Stati Uniti non sono affatto incoraggianti.
Yes, actually the PISA data regarding the United States are not encouraging at all. And we have been discussing this also during the previous edition of this festival. So there's another question here, another at the bottom, and then we'll close.
Canada. You keep bringing up I've noticed that you've always turn back to China in all of your examples. It's really the only reason it seems like we're talking about this. You know, all the other small countries that happen to not be democratic, and but they happen to be, you know, still surviving. They're not as big a deal. And I'm just wondering, I didn't hear what your actual opinion is. Is China doing the right thing by not becoming democratic right now? And the reason why I bring that up is I was at another conference a little while ago, and one of the professors brought up the idea that under weak rules of law, authoritarian regimes perform better nurturing efficient institutions than do democracies. And he brought up the examples of Singapore, North and South Korea. And so I was just wondering what your thought is on that. Are they doing the right thing by opening up to markets slowly and keeping their authoritarian regime, because large, quick changes, such as like the post-Washington consensus, might not be beneficial? So,
okay, there are two separable questions there. It's a very good, they're both good questions. One is about the opening up of markets. And, you know, and one is about the opening up of politics. The opening up of markets, I think experience so far suggests that the Chinese gradualism has probably been a good idea. That they, the shock therapy applied to other former communist regimes. China is a former communist regime, even though it says it's still communist. Has not worked very well, and that the Chinese have done extremely well at taking it in stages. I don't believe that the economic success of China is a case against democracy. For one thing, we now see India doing, having its own takeoff. That's a relief. We're now seeing that a poor democratic nation can also achieve rapid economic growth, which is encouraging. And there are offsets. Yes, sometimes an authoritarian regime can act more effectively to you know, it can bypass some of the things that might slow change in a democratic government, but it's not true. If what you have the idea, sometimes people have the idea that an authoritarian regime will be efficient because it won't be influenced by special interest groups. But that's not how it works. Authoritarian regimes are very much influenced by interest groups, sometimes more so. And they tend to get away with sometimes highly inefficient or destructive policies that would be subject to at least some correction in a democratic regime. So just to think about much, of course, there's the, we've had the terrible tragedy of the earthquake in China, much of which turns out to be due to failure to enforce construction standards. Now, if China were a democratic government, would it have enforced those standards? Maybe, maybe not, but there would have been more accountability, more likelihood that in the future the standards will be obeyed. There are inefficiencies and catastrophes that happen in authoritarian regimes that do not happen in democratic regimes. So, no, I think if if I could wave a magic wand and make China a democracy, tomorrow morning, I would do it. There's no evidence to suggest it would hurt their growth, and a lot of evidence to suggest it would make it a better country. And last point, the idea that we have, an authoritarian regime as a transitional stage, because it becomes, it will eventually become democratic. The whole point is that actually that doesn't look like it's at all guaranteed. And we just want to, we don't, if you have the opportunity to get liberty, you want to seize it, because it's not written in the books of history that necessarily it will come eventually anyway.
C'è ancora una domanda là in fondo? Prego.
Last question at the back. Yes, my name is Adriano. And I'd like you to clarify one point. If I have understood your conclusions correctly, you are optimistic insofar as you believe that economic development can lead to the development of democracy. And yet I have the impression that there is quite clearly a gap between the rich and the poor, which is much wider in countries which have been growing economically very quickly. Now, I don't think that democracy is just social safety nets. Democracy is also participation. And my impression is that participation in some fast-growing countries, as well as in our countries perhaps, has become a luxury. Do you agree?
So, first, no, I do not believe that economic growth brings democracy. That's the essential argument is that it does not have to happen. There's no guarantee whatsoever. If history had played out a little differently, even now we could have some wealthy countries that were not democratic. I see no sign that China is becoming more democratic. I see no sign that Russia, which has achieved a doubling of GDP in the past 10 years, is becoming any more democratic as a result. So this is not guaranteed. About democracy participation, this is how democracy fails. It doesn't fail, or at least it's one way. Sometimes democracy fails because the tanks come rolling down the street and put an end to it. But that's not what has happened in Russia. What has happened is there was some intimidation and people dropped out, and their life is getting better. There's money. Private lives are left mostly alone. It's a market economy. You can you can get by, and this is it's not. Of course, if you don't, to make a democracy requires that a substantial number of citizens really care about it, really vote, of course, but also really actively defend it. And it just comes back. No, my central point is exactly that there is nothing mechanical. There's nothing that's, that says that the march of technological progress and economic growth makes you, by necessity, a democratic country. It's an achievement, and it can be lost.
Domanda veloce, risposta veloce, quindi ne prendiamo l'ultimissima, davvero.
Okay, very last question. Good evening. Just one quick remark as regards the relationship between market and democracy. I'd like to move to the next room and discuss financial markets and democracy. I know that, well, you're an expert also on this. You know financial markets very well, and I believe that today democracy also is also transparency, and we know that we have been suffering from systemic crises which are closely correlated. So what is the degree of democracy within financial markets today? Because, well, transparency today in financial markets doesn't seem to be a strong point. Actually, the key point seems to be privatizing profits and socializing losses in financial markets.
Yeah, quite. First of all, I mean, you can have variety of kinds of financial markets with a democracy or without it, and they doesn't have to be all controlled. There is, however, pretty strong sense that let me put it this way: we had in the United States and to a large extent in other countries, we had a what you might have called a social democratic financial system 30 years ago. We had a system of regulated banks It was not socially controlled. It was certainly not government run, but there were extensive oversight, and it was a system that was designed to avoid crises and designed to be transparent as well. It was easy to see who was doing what. We developed what is now called by many people the parallel banking system or the shadow banking system. All of these non-transparent, complex deals that bypassed all of the regulations. And while I guess that's not inherently undemocratic, it turned out that it created a situation in which, exactly as you said, profits were private and losses were socialized, and nobody there was no accountability. So we now have a situation in which the central banks, the Federal Reserve, rushes to rescue businesses in crisis. None of this was the result of a democratic decision. There was never someone saying essentially saying to the public, do you want these freewheeling financial markets? Do you want this system, or do you want something that's more controlled and more limited? It was never advanced that way. It was simply done, it was largely done through administrative decisions out of the public eye that it was allowed to happen. I can't resist one last thing, the failings, the limitations of democracy. We have a situation right now in the United States where hedge fund managers, some of whom have incomes of more than $1 billion a year, have paid much lower taxes than, for example, I do. This was not a democratic decision. It happened through some obscure interpretation of the law, and attempts to change the law to eliminate that disparity have failed because the public doesn't understand the issue, and the hedge funds contribute a lot of money to politicians. And it's been shocking to see how something so gross, so dramatically unfair can remain uncorrected. And I'm sorry to say that both parties are colluding in this. So the limits of democracy and the power of markets to subvert democracy, I guess, are visible in this case.
Grazie, abbiamo sollevato tanti temi.
Thank you very much.
Che verranno ripresi nelle prossime.
Thank you very much for raising all these issues on which we'll return very soon. We will discuss China in the seminars with the person, and then the discussion with Federico Rampini, and then we'll discuss the relationship between growth and democracy again. Tomorrow there is a debate with Roland Rajan and Berglov. Also will discuss the transition to market economies in the former Soviet bloc. We'll also discuss the extent to which wealth can bring democracy in. Tomorrow Benjamin Friedman will discuss this in a historical light. And then Ruini Panda and Gilad Levi tomorrow. But this evening we're going to resume one point which has already been discussed by Professor KRUGMAN, to say the role of economic and political integration in Europe and its impact on the countries which are outside Europe. So European integration, economic power and political power will be discussed with Professor Mario Monti, former EU Commissioner, in the Teatro Sociale at 9. Thank you very much, Paul, for bearing with us and for replying to all the questions.